Hello there. I'm at the end of 2 fabulous weeks travelling in Tasmania. It's my first time to Tasmania, so it's been a pretty special experience, and I'm a little ashamed to admit that I've never been here before. But there have been a couple of other important milestones as well. This has been my first travels since the COVID demon struck back in February, March this year. So that's made it pretty special. And it's also my first travels since I suffered something called an aortic dissection in May this year. So that nearly killed me. So there's been a lot of pretty important symbolism on this little journey, and it's been wonderful to be back on the road again. And I'd love to show you a little bit of my first travels and my first time in Tasmania. This is not a complete travel guide to Tassie by any means. There is a lot to see on what might look like a small island. I'll give you a little taste of the place, and I plan to continue my Tasmania exploration very soon. Having spent 2 weeks, it's pretty clear to me now that you could easily spend 4 or longer, especially if you want to do some trekking. The Tassie late spring colours are in full bloom. It's beautiful in here. Known as Van Diemen's Land until 1855, this island played an outsized part in the tragedies that accompanied British settlement, the dispossession of the First Peoples, and the cruelty of the convict system. Half of all the convicts sent to Australia ended up here. I've been reading a lot of Australian history again, and Tasmania, there's no reading of early Australian history without sort of getting right into Tasmania's history. And that history, as well as Tasmania's reputation for stunning natural beauty, were the things that finally got me to this unique part of Australia. Hobart is an absolute charmer. A tiny city of less than 250,000 people. Reminders of the colonial past are everywhere. But right now, the city's enjoying a very contemporary rush of cool. And one massive private art gallery is driving that. It's called Mona, Museum of Old and New Art. And it's the creation of eccentric gambling maths geek done good David Walsh. Mona has transformed Hobart's place on the international art stage, and it's driven a new economy of cool eateries, distilleries, accommodation, wine and more in and around Hobart. Hobart's had a vibrant creative scene for a long time, but now it has a real focus. I walked Hobart. It's a great walking city. Its smaller, more modest economy has kept rapid growth in check and probably saved the architectural integrity of the city. The word's out though. Right now, Hobart is a little boom town. People from all over Australia want to live here. Salamanca Market on Saturdays is a standard tourist ritual. The old warehouses here, mostly built by convict labour, date back to the 1830s. Just behind Salamanca Market, Battery Point is a place of delightful architecture, peaceful streets, views, and some very tasty restaurants. Like everywhere in Tasmania, Hobart's setting is dramatic. Mount Wellington provides the backdrop, and I will not forget my Mount Wellington visit anytime soon. The weather had been wild and changeable all afternoon, and I thought I'd take a chance and head up anyway. It was actually the wildest wind I have ever encountered. There was nobody else up there. They must have known something I didn't. And the car door nearly blew off when I opened it up. And as I walked around, I thought I was going to blow off as well. But it was kind of worth it. It really was spectacular. And when it calmed down, a heavenly peace descended. And these were the views. Increasingly known again by its original indigenous name, Kananyi, the mountain has spiritual significance. The prison ruins at Port Arthur are about 100 kilometres from Hobart. This is Australia's best known convict history site. There are more than 30 19th century structures here, and the whole place is World Heritage listed. It still has a real atmosphere about it. Between 1833 and 1853, Port Arthur operated as a prison for reoffending convicts. Port Arthur is described as a prison for hardened criminals. For a time, this was the largest building complex in Australia. The site's vast, so the longer you stay, the more you'll get out of your visit. I visited 3 times over 3 days. There are some less well-known sites nearby, and they don't receive many visitors. The old convict coal mines are a short distance away. Prisoners that couldn't be brought into line at Port Arthur were sent here, a secondary prison for secondary prisoners. Because it's so quiet here, you get an even better sense of the sort of atmosphere of the place. There isn't much left at Puer. It was an extension to Port Arthur for boys as young as 10. Too young for the main prison. In a way, the absence of major ruins here adds to the sense of menace. Throughout my travels in Tasmania, there was a sense of the tragedy and brutality of the penal system, the dispossession of the First Nations people, crashing up against an awareness of the awesome beauty of this place. It's something I've never really felt in Australia before. It might have been because I was travelling alone and reading a lot, but it was very special. It was some kind of new sense of the country after 3 decades away. Port Arthur is right by where the Three Capes walk begins. I didn't do the walk this time, but headed down to Fortescue Bay for a dip. It was my first time in the sea since my medical disaster in May 2020. It felt very good. I gotta sort of have a little baptism in this ocean. Well, that's cold, but it's not too bad. It's no colder than it would be in Sydney on a cold day. So that's pretty good. I might have to get my goggles. Look at this place. Sublime deserted coastline is a Tasmania thing. I had it in spades as I headed north to Maria Island. Another former penal settlement that predates Port Arthur. Maria Island is alive with wildlife and rugged coastal beauty. This island was named by Abel Tasman in 1642. I find it kind of beyond incredible that Europeans were surveying this coastline so far away in 1642. Long before Cook arrived in New South Wales. This is the only island in Tasmania that's a national park, and it's home to an incredible amount of wildlife, including birds, rare birds, and apparently the sea life off this coast is also very special. The British invaders were charmed by the landscape of Tasmania, and they quickly started to reproduce the architectural styles and towns of home. So checking out Richmond, about half an hour north of Hobart, and I'm thinking that this has to be Australia's best preserved Georgian town. After days of history, I was ready for a dose of Tasmania's legendary natural beauty. The road trip to Strahan on the west coast filled that need. The drive takes you through Cradle Mountain, Lake St Clare National Park, which is some of the most beautiful country in Tasmania. Once again, I only did the short walks. My longest was around 4 hours. But even the short walks were bliss. A timely little history lesson in the middle of the forest here. It reads, when they walked peaceably into Hobart town in January 1832, all that was left of the big river nation, which had once numbered 400 to 500 people, was 16 men, 9 women and 1 child. This is the entrance to the massive Macquarie Harbour on Tasmania's west coast. In the early 19th century, this was the treacherous gateway to one of the most treacherous settlements in the Australian penal colony. Sarah Island, into the harbour from here, was second only to Norfolk Island in its reputation for cruelty. I first heard about Strahan in the early 1980s, not because of its 19th century prison, but because of its precious natural environment. We're on the Gordon River now, and I remember so well the battle to save this river, which sort of climaxed in my first year of university. And many would say it was the biggest environmental battle in Australian history. It was great to see the result of that battle 40 years later. It also reminded me that Tasmania has produced quite a few of my favourite Australians. And Bob Brown, the guy that led the campaign to save these rivers back in the 80s, is very high up that list. But I came away from Strahan as I came away from Tasmania, feeling like I'd spent too little time and that I'm gonna need to get back soon. That's a good thing. Thank you for 2 fabulous weeks, Tassie, and I look forward to seeing you again. I've mentioned how important books were during my travels, so I should mention the books. I'd recommend The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes, Van Diemen's Land by James Boyce, Truganini by Cassandra Pybus, and Anything by Henry Reynolds. They just happen to be the books I've read. There may be other really good titles as well. Thanks very much for joining me in Tasmania, and we'll talk again very soon. Rusty Compass is now on the road in Australia, so head over to rustycompass.com and check out what we're up to.